Hi, welcome everybody to our latest health policy webinar, and this one on accelerated coverage for breakthrough medical technologies. I'm Josh Makower. I'm the co-founder and director of the Stanford Musalem Center for Biodesign, and this is work that relates to our policy program. We started a policy program about 3 years ago. Focused on really all things relating to the health technology innovation ecosystem, and have engaged in a number of research projects, have an educational program as well, with fellows and others that we hope to get in contact with, as well as a convening function. And this is part of our convening function around various topics that are timely. And so we have a fantastic group of panelists who've joined us to cover this issue, which is currently a subject of discussion on the Hill. So we're pleased that the timing of this could work out. So maybe just to click to the next slide and share with you sort of our overall purpose and values. Fundamentally, Biodesign is here to advance health outcomes as well as health equity. And we want to do that through three verticals: innovation, education, translation, and policy. So that in those ways, we believe that if we can innovate, teach people to innovate, teach people to translate those innovations into reality, and also help people understand the innovation ecosystem around policy, that we can really advance healthcare for many. And our values are shown here on the right. I'll just take a brief moment to share with you our panelists today. Again, we're tremendously honored to have them with us, and we'll have a discussion after we present some of the updated data that we have to share. Marianne Hamilton Lopez. Dr. Lopez is the Senior Research Director of Biomedical Innovation at the Duke-Margolis Institute for Health Policy. We have Leah Kegler, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for Edwards Lifesciences. Tamara Syrek Jensen, who leads the coverage and analysis group at CMS, and then Sean Tunis, who is a senior fellow for the Center of the Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health at Tufts. And so we're very pleased to have all these folks here with us to have a discussion very shortly. But at this moment, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sandra Ruggles, who leads our research program.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh. All right, everyone, delighted to have you here today. And so for our webinar plan today, we're going to go through a little bit of background on coverage and Medicare coverage in particular for breakthrough technologies. And then we're going to turn it over to our panel for their perspectives. We've planned this as a webinar that both gives you a grounding in the space of coverage for new technologies, and then talks about the three primary policies that have been proposed, that have been implemented, or that are still in the legislative process around this area. And so we will have a chance to both hear from each of the panelists on the policies, as well as take your audience questions. If you have a question that you'd like to address to the panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom. That should be enabled so that you can ask your questions there. And we will strive to either cover them individually or consolidate them together into particular types of questions that we can address with our panel. We'll also aim to get you out of here just a little bit before the top of the hour so that you can move on to whatever is next in your day. So thanks for joining us. So I'm going to start with a grounding around Medicare coverage and why it matters, particularly in the framing of novel technologies. So coverage is one component of the path to physician reimbursement and patient access to technologies that support novel procedures, new items, services, or diagnostic tests. And coverage in particular is a component that has to go together with coding and payment. We focus on coverage because coverage can be different across any of the different payers in the healthcare insurance landscape. If you are covered by your employer in health insurance, there may be a coverage policy that defines your ability to access a particular procedure or a particular diagnostic. And the same is the case for Medicare beneficiaries in the United States. So Medicare coverage is important for let me back up and say, it's this path to establishing coverage that's something that we've heard from the innovation community can be a point of extreme frustration, challenge, and ultimately a process that can be confounding to the uptake of a new technology. We have some of that on the right-hand side of this slide here in the form of quotes from a paper we published back in 2022 around physician and innovator and investor experiences with establishing reimbursement for new technologies. And the landscape is one that is viewed as being fairly hazardous. We call this the valley of death, that time from FDA coverage or FDA authorization to Medicare or to commercial coverage. 2 points I want to make on the left-hand side here of this slide about coverage. First off, Medicare beneficiaries are assured coverage of a new technology when a local or national coverage determination exists. We call this explicit coverage. But in the absence of explicit coverage, this area of silent coverage, there can be differences in what kinds of coverage Medicare beneficiaries experience. Now there are 55% of Medicare beneficiaries who are enrolled in Medicare Advantage plans. And under the auspices of a Medicare Advantage plan, prior authorization can be used to modulate the utilization of a new technology. So set in this landscape, this is the backdrop with which we designed a study that we published last year on the time from FDA authorization to Medicare coverage for novel technologies. So we'll go through that at a high level through the next 3 slides. So we designed a process that was meant to select technologies that were most likely to include novel technologies. We selected technologies that were FDA authorized between the years 2016 to 2019 through 3 distinct pathways intended to select for novel technologies. That's the PMA, the de novo, and the breakthrough device designation pathways. Then we filtered those to where Medicare coverage would be applicable. Not every technology is covered by Medicare. There are certain technologies that are not covered benefits, and there are many technologies that are used exclusively in the hospital setting or are a piece of capital equipment that wouldn't be individually covered by Medicare. We also filtered to exclude technologies where coverage already existed. This was our way to eliminate technologies that were 2nd, 3rd, or 4th generation technologies already established within the healthcare landscape. And so with that, we went from 281 technologies down to 64. And those 64 we evaluated for whether they had achieved some form of Medicare coverage. We called this at least nominal Medicare coverage. And we defined that either through an explicit coverage determination, a national coverage determination, or an accumulation of local coverage determinations. We also created an endpoint that we called implicit coverage. For many who have pursued or developed a new technology, the establishment of a new CPT-1 code or the establishment of a permanent HCPCS Level 2 code is also sufficient to establish coverage for a new technology. So with these, we then profiled those 64 technologies. And of those 64, we found that time to coverage was highly variable, ranging from 91 days to 7 years. I think this, for me, was one of the key factors that we had been hearing from from manufacturers and innovators in the ecosystem was that it's difficult to plan for this process when there isn't necessarily a key set of landmarks or of goals that need to be met in order to establish coverage. The median time to coverage here was at least 5.7 years. And we did this through a Kaplan-Meier analysis. So what have we done since August of 23 when we published this? Well, we knew that we wanted to be able to extend the timelines here. If you look at this graph on the right, you'll see that more than half of the technologies that we studied in this initial article had not yet achieved a coverage milestone. And we thought that we had chosen dates for FDA authorization, those being between 2016 and 2019, that would have provided a cohort that had reached coverage. And instead, we found that we really desired to extend that timeline. So I'm happy today to talk a little bit and show you an updated version of our final figure from that publication in August of 23. And we've updated this time to coverage through September of 2024. And with that, 6 additional technologies have achieved coverage. However, 3 of those technologies achieved coverage faster than 5.7 years, and 3 achieved coverage slower than 5.7 years. And so we actually end up with a median time to coverage that remains at least 5.7 years. Though now we have over half of the cohort that was analyzed that had achieved coverage. I will note that we did have some dropouts out of the data set at this point, and some of those were because of companies that were no longer in business, and also because of some reanalysis of the data. So I think for me, this is this backdrop, and it's part of the conversation that has been going on around these programs that are and policies that have been established or are being proposed to provide coverage for novel technologies. And all of these programs are intended to bridge this gap between FDA authorization and the establishment of a coverage policy through Medicare for the procedure, or for the diagnostic, or for the item and service that is being provided to Medicare beneficiaries by the new technology. So let's do a quick rundown of the 3 policies that we're going to be profiling today. Each of our panelists is going to discuss one of these policies, and so you'll hear from them each individually with an overview. But I want to familiarize you with the shorthand that we use around each of them. So the original policy was the Medicare coverage of innovative technologies, or MCIT, and that provided 4 years of coverage. It was initially proposed and then withdrawn in September of 2021. Its replacement, proposed by CMS and implemented in August of this year, is the Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technologies Program, also known as TCET. And this is our only active program on the list. The last policy that we are talking about today is an emerging legislative effort around a House bill called HR 1691. And then just in the 2 weeks ago, a Senate bill, S5349, which was introduced November 20th, that will be a legislative version of this coverage program. So establishing coverage from after FDA authorization through a period of 4 years for a new technology. So with this, I'm going to hand it back to Josh and the panel to talk in more depth about each of these policies.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandy. So let's just start back with a little bit of history. I'm going to ask Dr. Lopez to just discuss MCIT a bit. what the original intent was and what perhaps were the reasons why it did not go forward. So over to you, Marianne.
Right, thanks, Josh. So as we just heard, has all begun because there's this premise that there are substantial gaps in access to breakthrough devices. So MCIT, as we saw just on the last slide, would have offered 4 years of automatic coverage for breakthrough devices upon receiving FDA authorization. But as we have also heard, MCIT was difficult to implement and it was ultimately withdrawn. One of the main challenges for why this was such a difficult policy has to do with some of the foundational differences between CMS and FDA. For CMS, a product needs to be reasonable and necessary for coverage. FDA approval, which is based on safe and effective, is only one of several criteria that CMS uses to determine coverage. So to illustrate that point, if there was a potential that MCIT might have required CMS to offer coverage for breakthrough devices that may not have included Medicare populations in their clinical trials. As we know, often clinical trials are not representative of Medicare populations, which tend to be older and have a greater number of comorbidities. So CMS expressed concern that MCIT potentially might have required CMS to provide coverage for a device without that supporting data that the device showed clinical benefits for Medicare populations. The other big challenge really came down to the evidence. So there was for one, it was the time frame legislation. That 4 years was seen as quite possible for certain devices, especially those that were based on claims data. However, for those devices that might require a registry be developed or had substantial questions about outcomes, that 4 years time frame was put into question. Also, there was not an enforcement mechanism when it came to collecting real-world evidence. So MCIT relied on manufacturers to voluntarily develop and collect evidence relative to Medicare patients during that 4 years automatic coverage period. However, while there was incentive to collect that necessary data to ensure the coverage after the MCIT period, there was not an enforcement mechanism to require that it was done. So not having an enforcement mechanism to ensure evidence collection could have made it difficult to collect and analyze data, determine if that breakthrough device was reasonable and necessary specifically for that Medicare populations. Additionally, there were some additional safety concerns within CMS, concerns that MCIT would unfairly reward companies that were first to break through devices, and also quite substantially that MCIT did not have a path or a process to minimize the gaps in coding and payment that come after FDA approval, which may still have resulted in some more barriers to access. So taken together, ultimately, this all led to the withdrawal of MCIT and its ultimate replacement by TCET.
Thank you very much. Tamara, I think this is a good moment for you to share with everyone what TCET is and the scope of it.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for the opportunity. So TCET, so we heard a lot from the public that we needed to have a more predictable process in order to get to national coverage, and then by extension, cover coding and payment. And so the agency developed the TCET pathway as an expedited pathway for FDA designated breakthrough devices. So the TCET pathway, I saw a question in the Q&A, is only for designated breakthrough devices. There are about, the last I checked, there are about 900, I think, devices that have that designation, and approximately 10% usually are approved for market authorization. And of those 10%, there's a smaller percentage that would be eligible for CMS coverage. And the reason that they would be only eligible for CMS coverage is because of the way the statute is set up, where we can only cover certain items or services, and in this case, devices, if Congress had outlined a statutory category for them. So there are some things we just can't write a decision on. So they have to be in the four corners of the statute of 1861 of the Social Security Act. So what TCET did is it set up a process where we would engage any eligible manufacturer. There's an application process, but we would set up a process where we would engage with the manufacturer. Collectively, we would take a look at the publicly available evidence. We would collectively see, okay, are there any gaps in this evidence? And we'd get around the table and talk about that, and then whether we should find a way to minimize those gaps. And the timing of TCET really is controlled for the most part by the manufacturer. So they can move, at least in the beginning, they can move as fast or slow as they want during this engagement. As we talk about the evidence base, are there any gaps? And is there a good way to minimize those gaps? And then once we have that conversation, the manufacturer can then decide, do we want a national coverage determination, or do we want to continue to work with our local contractors? CMS calls them the Medicare administrative contractors. These are the contractors that look at all the claims for fee-for-service, about 1 million a day, to make a decision on whether something is covered or non-covered. And so the manufacturer or the sponsor can then decide, do they want to do an NCD or work with their local MACs? And if they would like to do an NCD, that we have done a lot of pre-work up front. And so that is when we would go through our national coverage determination process, which is outlined in statute 1862L of the Social Security Act. It takes between 6 and 9 months. But the goal with TCET is, because we've done a lot of this pre-work, that we can shorten that time frame up. We can either issue a proposed on day 1 and then do the 30-day comment period and then the final. So that would be about 90 days. I think in the notice we said our ambitious goal is to get that done within 6 months. Up till today, TCET wasn't a program until August of 2024. So we have done some what we would call pilots, some experiments with different manufacturers. We have one out. We did one with IPAPS. The final is due in January. We currently have one open now on TTVR, where the proposed is due in December. As we learn more, we are hoping this will go faster and faster and faster. And so that we can get to the goals that you have outlined, predictable process, you know where we're headed. And the timing, we are hoping, is controlled more by the manufacturer than CMS, because how long, if it's CED, how long CED will last is really a proposal by the manufacturer versus CMS. We also heard there needs to be an end. And so part of what we're trying to do is also an end, not only of coverage with evidence development, if that's a decision, but also perhaps, a sunset of that with the national coverage determination, so that everybody knows when that NCD will end and something else might happen. So I tried to stay very, very high level. I'm happy to answer any questions after the other panelists or anything that you may have as well.
Great. Thanks, Tamara. Maybe if you could just mention the scope in terms of the number of technologies that might have an opportunity to enter this program per year.
Oh, that's a good question. So there's 900 that FDA has designated. We do about 10%. Oh, you're talking about the number. So, okay.
For TCET.
Yeah.
To enter TCET program.
Yeah. So the TCET program, what we put in the notice was 5. We understand that number sounds quite low. It is double the current NCDs we currently do. We think it's close to what is going for marketing, like FDA, that gets approved for FDA marketing, and the number that would be eligible or would want a national coverage determination process, national coverage determination. If there are more and we can expand our resources, we certainly can add more. So that number is giving everybody some transparency in what we can handle now and what we think is coming through the pipeline, but it certainly can expand with more resources and as FDA moves more through the pipeline.
Great, that's super helpful. And I think it might be nice for Leah Kegler, who can speak to, who I believe Edwards was one of the pilot companies, or is one of the pilot companies, and you have some experience with TCET. So maybe you can comment on your experience and how that differs from, let's say, the traditional pathway through Medicare.
Absolutely happy to do so. And as Tamara mentioned, there is currently an open NCA for the transcatheter tricuspid valve replacement. And so that is the Edwards Evoque valve, which got FDA approval back in February, is also breakthrough designated. And Edwards has been working with CMS for about a year and a half on piloting part of the components of TCET overall. And as part of that, there was no formal application pathway to pilot that, but we were already engaged with CMS as part of the parallel review program, and the timing of our approval and TCET allowed us to help to pilot some of these components and work very closely with CMS on the different parts of TCET. And so what are those components overall? We worked on an evidence preview, which was looking at a snapshot of the evidence that's available at that point in time and identified any evidence gaps that existed for our technology and understanding what that was overall, and worked through CMS. I believe they had a third-party contractor who did that work. And then once that was complete, we then went through and developed an evidence development plan, which includes our CED study overall. And the purpose of that was to figure out and to commit to further evidence development and evidence generation that would need to happen to fill any gaps that were found as part of the evidence preview overall. And so we've been continuing to work through that process as part of our that NCA process overall. And we have three major learnings that we brought or have experienced, and sort of really, as we think back on where we've been and where we're going, these are the things that we've learned. One, it's really important on the manufacturer side to have a cross-functional team. So to have the reimbursement experts, the medical affairs, the biostats, people with background in real-world evidence working on a team together to be able to answer the questions, have what is needed to have that back and forth and keep things moving with CMS, as Tamara mentioned. In addition, we found that the commitment of our senior leaders was really important. That helped us continue to be nimble and focus on what needed to be done. And then finally, as we've thought about it and looked at what our process has been overall too, is when is information for these breakthrough products going to be publicly available? Because that is important information to be able to continue to move the process forward. And so that takes a lot of forethought and sort of how this all fits together, as well as open lines of communication. And so that's, in a nutshell, some of the experience we've had.
Great. Thanks very much for that. And then lastly, I'd love for Dr. Tunis to address the two proposals that are still in play and that are being considered now. Both the House version, HR 1691, as well as the Senate corollary. It'd be great if you could talk about, what's motivating the creation of those and what they are and what they include and do not include at this moment. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks to you and Sandy for putting this webinar together and getting such well-informed speakers on the panel. So, briefly, the legislation that's been introduced that you mentioned in the House and the Senate, they look very similar to the original Medicare coverage of innovative technologies rule that Marianne described, in that they essentially allow for 4 years of automatic transitional coverage for approved breakthrough devices, so FDA-approved breakthrough devices. And that coverage would begin on the date of FDA approval and be effective for 4 years. Both bills are pretty short, so there's not a whole lot of details beyond that headline. The assumption is, and there's language in the bill that suggests that within those 4 years, Medicare would conduct before these 4 years ran out, that Medicare would conduct a national coverage review of the technology. it's possible that Medicare may decide not to develop a national coverage decision, and the technology would simply continue to be covered. But implicitly the assumption is, or and I imagine that this detail may be added to the bills as they get further along, that the company that developed, introduced, and got approval for the product would have 4 years to generate the evidence that they believe would meet the Medicare's reasonable and necessary standard, that again Marianne mentioned as distinct from safe and effective. Another couple just features of this legislation that are distinguish it from MCIT or TCET for that matter is the bill would include $10 million a year for CMS to add additional staff to support the additional work necessary to conduct their national coverage reviews. Neither MCIT nor TCET had those resources. And maybe just to focus on the most glaring difference between the TCET, the final TCET program, and the legislation is that with the legislation, the Medicare coverage is automatically granted for this 4-year period, whereas for TCET, there's the process in place where Tamara's team at CMS will need to engage with the product developer, come up with an evidence development plan, and all of that would need, and then that plan would need to be approved. All of that would need to take place before any coverage would be provided. And so the limiting factor there is that the interactions with the Medicare staffing in order to get these evidence development plans in place, and the legislation just simply grants the coverage that would begin at upon the date of FDA approval.
Thanks, John. I think that it's clear from the work that we've done looking at this area that reimbursement is definitely the most challenging step for any new novel technology, and certainly there's a huge need for patients, for patient access, to be able to work this step out, both with private insurers as well as with public, to enable them to gain access to these technologies to really advance the state of healthcare. I wonder whether I can ask Leah to come in and comment a little bit about these two pieces of legislation, and how do you, given you've gone through the process, it has some limitations. This could add new opportunity for companies like yours. Maybe how do you perceive it as a sort of a manufacturer here? Does this address the needs? Who would benefit? Who would be left out?
Sure. I think as we look at it and think about the legislative piece of it, I think it should be looked at as another opportunity. I think it's an opportunity to have CMS have resources to be able to be thinking about and working on these coverage policy overall. I think that the TCET is really very much focused on the NCD and process overall. And so I think with this, I think there's a broader opportunity there. And I think the other piece of it is, I think that the strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, where you see it out there, is an important piece. I think, especially in the environment we're in right now, to have the opportunity to have that understanding of Congress, of the legislative branch, and hopefully to work with the executive branch and sort of saying, hey, this is a direction that is important for access overall.
Absolutely. Now maybe I'll just sort of engage I'll pull a few questions out that people have asked from the Q&A at this point, but I'm very curious to hear if someone wants to make a comment, because originally I think the intent here was to have quite a broad inclusion of all breakthrough technologies. That has since been limited to benefit categories, and then even got limited further. So maybe someone can speak to the latest markups and sort of what's in and what's out of the current legislation. I don't know if Marianne, you want to take that one, or someone on the panel wants to speak to the current legislation as it's been evolving.
Yeah, I'll turn that one over to Sean and Leah.
Okay.
I mean, my understanding is that there continues to be this requirement that a technology has to fit within an established Medicare benefit category. So, that's there's issues in terms of a number of digital health innovations don't necessarily fit into benefit categories. So there's a lot of areas of innovation that would be excluded, but that would require a separate legislative fix for because Medicare can't do anything about that. So there would be a separate legislative requirement to expand the benefit categories that are eligible for Medicare coverage. And that can potentially get into some fairly large, cost estimates from the CBO that would have to be then paid for through other mechanisms. I believe, but Leah, confirm if I'm correct on this, that diagnostic tests are excluded from the legislative automatic coverage.
They are actually part of it. I think there was a little bit of confusion with the Ways and Means bill that had gone through, and I think there was an effort to add those back in what was introduced in the Senate. But going back to your previous point, Sean, I think you make a great point about about the CBO score and sort of what that means overall. And I think over the years, or even within this latest, sort of 2 years of this Congress, you've seen, starting out with a pretty high score, 7 to 12 billion over 10 years is, I think, kind of what was thrown around quite a bit. I don't know if there was ever an official CBO score at that. And then with this latest version that is consistent with what went through Ways and Means, and then also is consistent with what's in the Senate bill that was introduced last month, the score for that is under $1 billion, which I think, again, is more palatable to Congress and looking at this overall. I do think it's probably a pretty heavy lift to have this included in some sort of end of the year package, but there are, conversations going on about that right now. But I think this may be something that gets moved into the next Congress, just depending on, sort of how the next couple weeks play out in Washington.
Right. I think that is clear. And just to, sort of frame this up for those who are joining without all the full background, breakthroughs are really meant to be total transforming innovations that are made for people who have no other alternatives, where there's really no good alternative that exists, and there's a huge clinical need. And they've been deemed as such at a time with FDA to give them more attention going through the FDA process. And that generally means that if they were to actually ultimately be cleared, that then, they would be something that could be very valuable for patients on the other side. So that's the reason why these programs have focused on breakthrough. And per our research, to see how long it actually takes for breakthroughs to get to patient access is really too long for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the innovation ecosystem of investors, inventors, physicians, et cetera, that are really trying to advance these to gain patient access, but the patients themselves, and to be able to make them available earlier is a great service. And the ability that these two bills have put forward to advance more resources for CMS to be able to have more bandwidth to be able to address those innovations is really significant. I think it's also important to note that there are many other steps here, not just CMS is only one of the pieces of the puzzle. As we all know, there's 3 pieces that have to go into getting a product, sort of to patient access. It's coding, coverage, and payment. And we're really just talking about coverage as one of the steps here. But I think the way many of us are looking at it in the field is, you got to start somewhere. And try to make wins where we can and try to hopefully advance some technologies that are going to improve people's lives sooner than later that have the most significance. And that's why it's also focused in breakthrough. I also believe in the most recent markup, there's sort of a proposed date at which one would qualify. So historically approved breakthroughs or cleared breakthroughs or authorized breakthroughs would not be candidates. So as my understanding, the latest version of this, one of the reasons why it's also gotten cheaper is that in the negotiation process, those were removed. So I think that's important for, the entrepreneurs here who already have a breakthrough that has already been cleared. Unfortunately, this is really a forward-looking opportunity and less of a retrospective. I think I'm correct about that, but happy to take any alternate views if I think we're right. All right, let's take a few questions from the group here.
And Josh, do you mind if I ask a question to my panelists
Oh, sure.
here? Thank you. Well, I just, as we're looking at the legislation as Sean laid it out there, and there are some similarities to MCET, and then there's certainly a lot of lessons learned with TCET. If we want there to be success, if we want there to shorten, access gaps, what would we do differently with the proposed legislation, especially if it's following this kind of automatic coverage from FDA to make it more successful in the long term, so it doesn't, find the same kind of evidence concerns or kind of problems to implementation that MCIT followed?
Well, yeah, I'd be interested. I know that Tamara is probably not going to comment on pending legislation, but she'd probably have the smartest answer on this one. But as you said, Marianne, to start out, the biggest concern and reason I think that the MCET was ultimately withdrawn was this concern that technologies that can be breakthrough technologies that can be approved by the FDA may not have a substantial amount of evidence in the Medicare population with all their comorbidities. So there's potential, questions about safety and efficacy in the Medicare population. That's, one concern that was raised. The second one is, this is sort of, people say, well, what's the difference between reasonable and necessary and safe and effective? One of the big features that is a differentiator is the kind of outcomes that Medicare tends to look at in terms of patient benefit, which may be different than what the FDA might look at, not just surrogate outcomes, but maybe, Medicare, more emphasis on outcomes that really impact patients' ability to function, and reductions in morbidity that may not be necessary to demonstrate at the time of FDA approval. So all this is getting to, the more I think the legislative solution could provide some reassurance that during the 4-year period, there would be attention to ensuring that evidence is generated in an efficient way, and that Medicare patients are not exposed to technologies that may result in risks that have not yet been fully assessed.
So there's a question in the on the Q&A here about the early payer feedback program and whether that can be helpful here. Tamara, you want to speak about that program at all, and whether there's any opportunity to enhance perhaps the likelihood of being accepted for TCET by that engagement?
So I think we're talking about the FDA program, maybe the TAP program. And so we are working closely with the FDA. And I think as you work with the TAP program, if you think you're a good candidate for TCET, really work with them so that they can talk with us. At the end of the day, though, you please put in an application into the TCET portal, which the next application are due January 31st, so that we can take a look at those and add them to the, add them as part of the TCET candidate. I can tell you with the last applicants we got, and we got many, one of the challenges that we saw was either a couple of them are already outside the pre-market phase, they're already marketed, they're already on the market, or there was no benefit category. And that's really challenging for us. So if there's no benefit category, we need to put you down a different path to either go through rulemaking or with our colleagues to determine what your benefit category is. So really take a look at those two things when you do apply. But we're happy to answer any other questions as well.
Great, thank you. And does someone, there's a question about what is the date actually that is registered in terms of which breakthroughs, when the breakthroughs would start qualifying under, let's say, if the new legislation were to pass, what's the current date that legislation focus on? Does someone have that at their fingertips?
I believe it's based on the date of passage overall. So it would be built off of that, if I remember correctly in my last read of it. There is also a period of time in the legislation that allows for CMS to figure out how they are going to set the program up too. And so there is, I believe 18 months is what's there for that. So those are sort of two important, I think, data points from the legislative proposal.
Fantastic. Another one that's that a number of the folks sending in questions seems to be circulating around is sort of what is the scope of the products that are included and which are excluded. I wonder whether we can, I believe that digital health is not included, unfortunately, in the most recent cut. Are there others that are sort of in versus out as it stands right now?
Is that for me? Are you talking about legislation or
Yeah, well, I think we're probably talking about legislation. So maybe what I think would be relevant would be benefit categories, actually, Tamara, if you could comment on that, because obviously it has to be in a benefit category to be in. And then maybe I can pivot to one of the other panelists to discuss which beyond benefit category, what are the other things that have made it in and out?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question because it is a lot of people ask us this, and what we need to remember is the Social Security Act was mostly written in 1965. So I don't even know if digital was a word in the Webster Dictionary in 1965 or artificial intelligence. And so it's those types of challenges, and Sean alluded to those earlier, that we have is reading the statute and trying to figure out how do these fit within the statute. And so that is our challenge. And that is when we talk about benefit categories, we really are talking about what has Congress allowed us to even make a decision on. And so digital is really challenging in the statute. They have made a step forward with digital with some mental health products, and artificial intelligence is also challenging as well with algorithms and those types of things, although there is some progress in that as well. So those are challenging for us. And I think if you look at the FDA 900 list or product list, there's a lot of digital technologies in there. And so now what we have is 5 will definitely increase as soon as if we get authority to do digital.
Right.
One of the other big categories that is problematic, and I think there's a fair amount of interest in, is sort of, this the screening and prevention or early intervention for high-risk patients. So Medicare cannot pay for anything unless a patient has, current signs or symptoms of disease. So everything that's sort of short of that, as in, let's say someone high risk of developing diabetes, any intervention for a patient like that would be excluded because the definition that's used for screening or prevention is that, an individual demonstrating signs or symptoms of disease, even sort of patients with like a family history of breast cancer, let's say, that might be high risk and, eligible for certain genetic tests or things like that, those would not fit in the benefit category. So that can be a big class of things that are excluded.
Yeah. And I think it was stated earlier, I think, in the world of trying to advance patient access and policies that really address, problems that have been unsolved and advancing healthcare, there are multiple tools. And I think the way to look at these two bills that are being proposed is they're exceptionally important because they do go down the fairway in terms of benefit category, as well as sort of what is reasonable within a first step. But it's also clear from the discussants that, it is worthy at this time to, in some future conversation, to revisit the scope of this coverage beyond benefit categories and really think about what the opportunities for improvement of health might be if we could enable coverage for those and payment for those as well for the greater population of Medicare patients as we really look to advance disease. So that clearly would not be a part of this legislation, but it's still an important topic for the future that we probably should be thinking about as we look towards the future and the aging population and their needs and how we really improve health overall. I'm going to give each panelist a chance to kind of summarize, their thoughts and perhaps, how they, their hopes. And maybe I'll start with you, Tamara. I know you're limited. You can't talk about the legislation, but if you can share some guidelines, perhaps for folks listening in, many of whom are innovators, about what they should do to be able to explore the TCET program and engage CMS properly, that would be great.
Well, one, call us, reach out, talk to us, and we can answer any questions to see where you are in your product life cycle and are you eligible for TCET? And if you are, we want to engage to get involved. We want to get more experience, to get faster and faster, to meet what everyone has asked us to do: predictability, coverage of good technologies, evidence of the Medicare population, and for us to engage to get there together. So I know we're running out of time. I have a lot to say about TCET, but I'm happy to answer any questions even after this.
Thank you. Marianne?
Well, just starting by saying, I think there's just so, it should be really commended to see the level of communication and progress that has happened between CMS and manufacturers, and kind of this earlier conversations about what evidence matters is so important, because then you're not getting to the end of your process and realizing everybody's on a different page. So I think that just through the experience of MCIT and TCET, there's been so many lessons learned about how to make this a better process, how to make it faster. And I think my main kind of, what you're saying, hopes and dreams there, Josh, is that as we're looking ahead, and if there is potential for this legislation, finally some acknowledgement that CMS does need the resources to do the important work that it's doing, but also just learning from what these programs that have done in the past, and so that we can be more successful and kind of get through some of the implementation challenges that came with the first program. And so I just think that everyone's trying to get to the same goal, and we could put together a lot of lessons learned to get us there.
Absolutely. Sean?
Yeah, I would also say, I think what CMS has done with TCET is, about as good as a policy mechanism as you could have, given the resources and the authorities that the agency has. It's mostly ever going to impact, I think, fairly high cost, high risk technologies, because it's not suitable and matched for the kind of resources that I think kind of lower cost, but potentially, and lower risk, but potentially transformative technologies are going to represent. So I think that the kind of legislative direction that, the only way to sort of address the kind of these uncertainty about timeline and process is some kind of mechanism that enables sort of what we call early coverage with better mechanisms for ensuring that whatever uncertainties are addressed efficiently following it. But the last thing I'll say is I do feel as though inadvertently the current policy framework, discourages investors from wanting to take a chance on technologies for which there isn't already a code, a coverage decision, a payment mechanism, a bundle payment. And as you know, Josh, and your colleagues on the phone, there's a ton of great stuff coming through that probably is difficult to fund just because it doesn't have a clear pathway to reimbursement.
Exactly. Leah?
Sure. I think I have 2 points. I think one, Edwards has been fortunate to be able to pilot components of the program overall. And certainly based on our experience, everything that Tamara is saying about the desire of CMS to engage and sort of talk through these processes has very much reflected the experience that we've had. And I think that's a very positive thing as this program is rolled out and implemented. And then on the legislative side, I think it's always important to take a step back and remember that legislating is often the art of the possible. And so I think right now we're looking at something that is what is possible and what is a first step. And then as that happens, what more or what other elements could be looked at overall.
Absolutely. And I'll just close by saying, at the end of the day, it's all about advancing patient care. It's about improving the quality of life for patients. And these two bills do advance forward a very important need that the ecosystem has. And that ecosystem, as Sean mentioned, includes investors, includes innovators, includes patients and the physicians that do these studies. It's really the entire group of individuals and entities that come together to make a product available for people that need it. And so I really want to thank those members of Congress on both sides of the aisle for supporting these bills. I want to thank the panelists here who have contributed their time and all work at various aspects to try to advance and create policies to improve the quality of life of patients. And of course, thank all of you who've attended today for your time. And there was a question about what one can do. I'm sure you can write to your congressperson if these bills are important to you, give them your opinions, and I'm sure they would be happy to hear them. And thank you all for your attendance today, and have a great day.